If someone was counting on hearing about Freud, who himself should be treated, then they can turn off this film now. If someone was counting on us talking about the fact that book religions originate from Judaism, then they can also turn off this film because they do not. If at this moment someone is counting on the history of sectarian views on the Slavs as the first civilization, thank you as well. We will be talking about the real Avesta here, not the one created many centuries later, a fake one. Supposedly the same, but suitable at most for pressing recently glued objects so that the glue would catch. The Avesta is a forgotten book. The Avesta is a book of the first book religion, which somewhat of its own accord disappeared from the memory of descendants, associated with the equally forgotten, but still existing first book religion. The magi who traveled to the manger were Zoroastrians. And it is precisely what was done with the Avesta that made the modern religions of the book full of contradictions. The Avesta is the first. Here we will also answer the question of why Islam considers dogs to be unclean animals. Where did this come from and why this superstition has nothing to do with the Quran, but was very necessary politically, from which animals suffer to this day, and also the significance of Mazdiyasna in modern religion. This is the history of the oldest religion of the book. Zoroastrianism, Baydin, Mazdiyasna, the main known as fire worship. Zoroaster to Jesus before and Buddha specified by the Prophet about its sources, and we can confirm this historically, although we are not sure if that was really his name. If someone wants to say now that Jesus does not exist, it means that he does not have basic knowledge. Contains his death certificate and mention in Tacitus. Existing mainly in Persia, brought to the underground legal basis forgotten, but once it was completely different. Were a religion of conquest and divided into people like Cyrus or Cambyses for war. It is the change of Avesta that will be affected by paradoxes in the Bible. Although today Zoroastrianism is written in a monotheistic religion, in reality it is a dualistic religion, and in the beginning even polytheistic. At the time of the clash with Islam, attempts were made to give minor deities a different role, but it worked a little too late. It is a mediator between Brahmanism and the religions we know. Judaism was also dualistic for a long time. It is not known when God lost his wife, whether it was misogyny or the enormous influence of Akhenaten, whose texts in a perfidious, primitive way were transferred to the Bible, without even trying to change them a bit, fearing legal consequences. This is the first known copy-paste. This is the oldest revealed religion with the doctrine and principle covering the whole world. We do not realize what influence it had on humanity, because its successors cared about it, and the priests of Mazdaism also squandered the opportunity. It was the state religion of 3 Iranian empires, some regions of India, and some cults influenced Rome, which, thanks to the cults of Sol Invictus and Mitra, was already monotheistic at the time of Jesus' appearance. It is in the Avesta that the creation of the world in 7 days appears for the first time. First, Ahura Mazda created 6 helpers who helped to realize the acts of creation. They also created other beneficent deities such as Mitra, worshipped by the Romans. They are called Yazada. This has nothing to do with the Yazidism religion. Stones and the sky were created, then the earth, living creatures, fire, and then the sun. Finally, the gods sacrificed a bull, a plant, and a man, through which they brought more animals, people, and plants into being. All of this was first created in an immaterial being, and only then was it given shape. Achieving this state led to the creation of a battlefield with evil, because corporeality can be subjected to the attacks of Ungramenu. It was Ungramenu, also known as Ahriman, who sneaked violently through the hemisphere of heaven and destroyed perfection, creating deserts and salt water, for example. He is the opposing side of Ahura Mazda. The Avesta never explained where he came from, changing the version on this subject. Initially, it was claimed that they were 2 brothers. A later branch of the religion believed that God created him, which influenced the shape of the Bible, but raised a serious question. Did God accept evil? To be precise, the religion was really connected to the Medes, who were the elite of the people living in Iran, while the Persians were more of a people attached to the land, although both people entered the lands of Iran from the Caspian Sea, but for centuries they were the ruling elite, to whom the Persians were not allowed, who were eventually driven to the lands of Anshan. Then the Greeks meet a new people whom they call Pars. However, this is not an adequate description of the inhabitants of these lands, and over time it became misleading. After death, the soul separates from the body and wanders the earth for 3 days, after which it descends to the kingdom of the dead ruled by the first man Yima. There, they live a life of shadows, and clothing and food are provided by offerings made by the living. These 3 days will last in all religions of the books. This is also due to pragmatism. Probably comas or lethargy were already known at that time. Zoroastrians abandon bodies. They assume that what belongs to nature should return to it. Vultures play an important role here, which are also one of the most important symbols of religion, especially ossifrage. Only after being cleansed, the corpse is placed in the ground or left in special buildings resembling towers. The corpses were taken care of by people who were involved in funerals. The religion took its European name from the name of the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. Both forms are correct. Little is known about him. He was the son of Purushastva from the Spatama clan. His fate is known from the poetic Gathas, which can be compared to psalms with a hint of mantras. His teachings were initially transmitted orally. Over the years, he gained only one disciple, his nephew Madhyo Amanha, who was loyal to him. He in turn won over King Wishtasp, who after fighting established the Zoroastrian state religion. In order for a priest to be able to practice his religion well, marriage was necessary. So the prophet married 3 times. We do not know the names of his wives. He had 3 sons and 3 daughters. Only the marriage of Purushasta's daughter is described, who married the king's advisor. We can say that the prophet knew that a good marriage would provide him with influence and help expand the influence of the religion. He was stabbed to death by a pagan priest. He called himself Zayatar, which means priest, so we don't know if we really use this man's name when we talk about him. According to tradition, he was about 30 years old when he began teaching. Let's not take it seriously, but this number will become quite important in the Bible, and even Jesus will die at the age of 33. This is symbolic. In reality, due to calendar errors, 7 to 12 years must be added. This is the minimum, and it is even considered that Jesus was over 50. This is the maximum. Was the episode about that? It is also worth mentioning that Zoroaster performed the holy ablution. Islam and Christianity adopted this, although in a more pure and fragrant way. The Gathas were written in various languages, but the last codification was done during the Sassanids in the Pahlavi language, and the older parts were left in the Gathas language, an old language similar to the Rigveda. When the artificial Pahlavi dynasty was created, it was from here that the name for the family was chosen. The most important thing that distinguishes the Avesta from other books is the official existence of 2 demiurges, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Good and Order, and Angra Mainyu, the Lord of Evil and Chaos, who fight each other. But it is Ahura Mazda who always wins. Reducing Lucifer to a lower role and persistent attempts to create monotheism made the Bible inconsistent in matters of the roles played by Lucifer. After all, he is still the angel of justice. No one took this role away from him, but suddenly he becomes a demon. Despite this, we have to appeal to him if we want justice. He supposedly has his own kingdom, but he is subject to the will of God. These and many other paradoxes result from the fact that at some point some wanted to cut themselves off from the first religion of the book tradition, forgetting about important details, just to subordinate the text to the new trend of thought of monotheism. Only, to put it bluntly, they forgot about what was written a page earlier. Ungramenyu and Aramazda did not always fight each other. During their first meeting, they created everything that exists, as well as heaven and hell, death, good and evil, leaving free choice. It seems that the ritual of water and fire has remained unchanged. According to the revelation of Zarathustra, the time of triumph will finally come and Ungramenyu will be completely defeated. Then the time of separation will come, evil will disappear and eternal happiness will come. It is the Avesta that first tells of the Last Judgment, and the doctrine will be accepted in various forms by most religions. Salvation, however, depends on deeds, thoughts, and words. How a person lived, and no prayers here will help in salvation. It should also be remembered that the Avesta states that every being has a soul, which over time stopped appealing to the followers of new religions built on its basis. Similarly to Islam, at least in the beginning and in some regions still Quran didn't change, but not everyone accepted it. This often resulted from war disputes or local whims. Groups that did not want to submit to the new religion suddenly lost it. This happens all the time when we talk about religions of books. One of the most powerful magics associated with them, as well as atheism. If you do not think like me, it is best to eliminate you. Interestingly, the Avesta places the poor and needy as the first in heaven before the rich. Christianity did not come up with a new dream. You could say that they were the first communists, but as is usually the case with communism, socialism is not communism. The idea was dead. The very deification of the ruler contradicted it. The followers also wear a rope tied around the kibasai, which they do not part with. It is untied and tied during prayer. And initiation takes place at the age of 15. Prayer takes place 5 times a day. This custom will permeate Islam, although fanatics will probably say otherwise. In addition, there are 7 holidays, the most important of which is the spring equinox. The oldest prayer is a Hunwer, the equivalent of the Lord's Prayer in Christianity, created after the death of the Prophet Farwarain, can be compared to the Islamic Shahada. It is very similar, by the way. I confess that I am a follower of Ahura Mazda, a supporter of Zarathustra. Ahura Mazda attributes all goodness to Arima Ishio is recited during wedding ceremonies. It is not attributed to the prophet. It is in this prayer that the word Mazdayasna appears to describe the followers, from which another name for the religion Mazdayasna comes from. Is it really a dualistic or polytheistic religion? It is really difficult to determine, because the role of divine helpers is unclear. It is rather still polytheism, but do jinns in Islam, demons, angels, archangels in religions of books also testify to monotheism? Maybe we never created monotheism in the pure sense of the word. We are not entirely sure how the first Mazdists saw it. The Romans distorted the knowledge of this religion. They took over some cults, especially those of Mitra, Attis, and deformed them greatly. The liturgy itself was created much later. Zarathustra had been dead for a long time. The whole thing can be compared to the recitation of mantras. The liturgy ends with the Hemwohu. Hymns, which gave rise to psalms, also played a great role. Many of them are older and even contradictory to Zarathustra's message, just as the Old Testament is to the New. Only Sina, son of Ahumstat, had 100 disciples. It is Avesta that first mentions the coming of the Savior Saoshyant. He who will bring benefits. He will lead people to the last battle of good and evil. Interestingly, he is to be born from Zoroaster's sperm stored in a lake in which a virgin will bathe and conceive a son, Asvateret, the embodiment of righteousness. Does this remind us of anything? Now we know where Mary's virginity came from, which is also difficult to maintain and explain, when we start reading about James, Jesus' brother, and then about other family members who, the deeper we go into the text, turn into cousins, brothers, cousins, uncles. The worst thing is when someone starts creating some dogma that has little to do with reality and forgets that it's created. With time, the character of Zoroaster also began to live his own life. He received divine powers that he probably did not wish for during his lifetime. He began to perform miracles. He was also tempted by unclean, which also reminds us of a certain story. The biblical authors certainly knew the Avesta. It was not fought against in the times of the first Christians as much as it was during Islam, for which it was a powerful competition, and the priests were not able to put up as strong a resistance as they put up against the Christians. But when Byzantium began to be powerful, of course it changed. It naturally inspired. It is worth getting to know the Avesta, the real one, because the Avesta of the Proto-Slavs as well exists. The text is supposedly the same, but the inserts and footnotes refer to the Slavic nations, making them the chosen nations. This is very cleverly sold, and the title of the book has not been changed. You can familiarize yourself with this text, remembering that it is a text of a Nazi sect and has nothing to do with the Avesta and Mazdyasna. It naturally inspired successors. It is worth getting to know the Avesta, the real one, because the Avesta of the Proto-Slavs still exists. The text is supposedly the same, but the inserts and footnotes refer to the Slavic nations, making them the chosen nations. This is very cleverly liked, and the title of the book has not been changed. You can familiarize yourself with this text, remembering that it is a text of a Nazi sect and has nothing to do with the Avesta and Mazdyasna. It talks about Indo-Europeans. The Slavs had nothing to do with the Avesta, and Mazdyasna is the religion of Persia. To understand the paradoxes of the Bible, we must know the Avesta, because what was removed from it, clumsily reworked, led to paradoxes in subsequent religions based on the Avesta. These books did not fall from heaven. Many will be offended. Cattle urine has not been used for ablution since several centuries. This disgusting ritual led to the fact that Islam, which had to fight the followers of the Avesta, began to consider some animals unclean and did not favor good relations with the followers of the old religion. Interestingly, we will not find these theories in the Quran or the Sunnah. Fanatic Muslims will have a hard time trying to explain it to us, but there is no basis for it. The aversion to dogs and cattle came from the war for followers with the Zoroastrians, who respected these animals. Zoroastrianism is closely related to Christmas. It was the priests of Zoroastrianism who reached Jesus. They were famous for creating horoscopes, reading the stars and using them. Today, no biblical scholar will talk about the three kings, and even the popes tried to avoid this concept. They were also not people of different skin colors. This tradition was sanctioned centuries later to sanction the authority of religion over all peoples. The commandments of Zoroastrianism also include supporting the healthy growth of plants, taking care of the earth, and the well-being of animals. The religion places great emphasis on the purity of water, which creates quite strange recommendations about rinsing objects that need to be washed with cattle urine at the beginning. This religion also forbids burning rubbish. There are also unclean creatures that should be destroyed outright, such as scorpions, wasps, toads, and even predators. This contradicts the role of vultures. Women are unclean during menstruation, which disappeared in Christian belief after contact with Freemasonry, but it can still be heard among more Orthodox Muslims, or some especially Protestant sections. The holiest city is Raga. From the time of Cambyses, we have records of support for incestuous marriages within the royal family. We do not know how much this was influenced by contact with Egyptian culture. It should not be forgotten that the Persian dynasty briefly conquered Egypt. Mothers could also marry their sons, and fathers their daughters. It seems that it was more of a pragmatism so that power would remain in the family. The modern appearance of temples is due to famous rulers such as Ardashir. From then on, the hearth was built on a platform resembling an altar. The fire could not be extinguished. In palaces, it was a symbol of the ruler's majesty. The first temple buildings were also built. A new spiritual hierarchy was created at that time, and the custom of making sacrifices at the tombs of great rulers was born. The influence of priests also became increasingly significant on power. The traditional white priestly attire was born at that time. As is the case with every religion, heresies occurred. Zoroastrianism played the greatest role here, which weakened Zoroastrianism in the fight against new religions. It proclaimed that Angra Mainyu was created by Ahura Mazda. Animal sacrifices always had to be heat-treated. The priest decided what to do with them. Let's be honest, he often had dinner. During Shapur's reign, the prophet Keppler appeared, the owner of large landed estates. He became famous for his theological conflict with Basil. This conflict led to the development of fanaticism and mutual hostility between Christians and Zoroastrianism. This led to local but large-scale fights, in which both sides destroyed each other, changing the map of religions. Until now, the followers of Mazdayasna had tolerated other views, although mixed marriages were out of the question. Over time, Mazdayasna began to quarrel with its neighbors over all views. Judaism was cursed for claiming that vermin also came from God, and the Christians' love of filth, contemplation, and lack of desire for pleasure also brought about conflict. It seems that it was not so much circumcision or forbidden foods that were terrible for the Persians when they encountered Islam, but the ban on drinking alcohol, as well as the way of paying homage to God. A Zoroastrian stands and a Muslim kneels. So the priests went to a scientific war, thinking that they would succeed as they had with the Christians. They were already a powerful body influencing power politics, maintained at the expense of the population. They were wrong. Islam was to knock them into oblivion. They came across stronger believers than those who stuck to their guns. Islam also came across a good moment in history. For several hundred years, the growing power of the priests and their meddling in politics had irritated the Persian kings as much as the pharaoh's Karnak. The people were also irritated by the wealth and pride of the priests, and the basic assumptions about almsgiving and praying 5 times a day were identical, which meant that ordinary believers who were not very familiar with the religion did not see the differences. Zoroastrianism was one of the first religions to openly conduct missions. The Medes or magi were wandering priests who preached the ideas of their faith beyond borders. It was probably them who reached Jesus. Simeon Magus was probably also a Zoroastrian. For the Mazdists, monotheism was equal to the idea of an unpredictable God whose intentions cannot be understood. Looking from the outside, one might be tempted to say so. When the figure of Lucifer began to be manipulated, the figure of God became unclear. Contradictory. He is supposedly good, but he orders child sacrifices. He is supposedly good and there is a ruler of evil, but he is subject to the will of God, and therefore God wants this evil. This is absolutely true, but the Mazdas did not notice that without evil their religion would also make no sense. Ahura Mazda would become unnecessary. These two forces are necessary to be able to distinguish. Otherwise, these concepts would have to be removed and everything accepted. Zoroastrianism, despite its conquest, was a huge problem for the first caliphs. The Umayyads, apart from Omar II, did not really fight against this religion. They established their capital in Syria. However, the Mazdists always had a grudge. The fact that this war ended as it did was mainly due to the Mazdists. The introduction of Arabic into offices was met with resistance, not so much among the people as among the clergy. Muslim scholars, however, had no qualms about learning the holy books of the Persians in their language. The great merit here was owed to the neophyte Razbay al-Makafa, who was quickly cursed by his own people, but in fact thanks to him we learned the history of the Sassanids, and Persian poetry gave rise to Arabic poetry. although divinity figures were deprived of their divinity much too late, and the religion was still accused of polytheism. Most of the Mazdean texts were translated, so that the old families that accepted conversion could still trace their lineage far back. Origin ceased to be really important after World War II, but at that time the history of the family did matter. Referring to the figure of Salman Farasini, who converted from Mazdaism to Christianity and eventually became a close warrior of Muhammad, Muslims began to emphasize this figure's connection with Persia, thereby sanctioning the ties of Islam with the country, as well as the old religion. The priests took this as an insult, although it is undeniable that this person existed. The fuel to the fire was added by a false legend that Hussein, son of Ali and Fatima, married a Sassanid princess. The legend was supposed to sanction the emerging branch of Shurism, but it also influenced Mazdiyasna. The neophytes, on the other hand, saw in Shurism a chance to throw off the yoke of the Umayyads and be someone equal to the Sunnis. Mazdiyasna was no longer the only trend standing guard over patriotism. When the Shiite Caliphate was established in Baghdad, and the Abbasid dynasty took power, the new caliphs favored Iranians, who helped them take power, although the priest of Zoroastrianism remained one of the caliph's advisors. The functioning of the court also began to be modeled on the Sassanid model. The gates to a global career opened for Iranian Muslims. Nationality was becoming less and less of a factor in the dispute, and religion more and more. The priests kept shouting that abandoning Mazdiyasna meant being un-Iranian, although what really hurt them was the loss of temple donations in this fight for souls. The rulers, on the other hand, began to have problems with gnosis and the sects emerging within Islam, which they had to combat. However, both sides did not notice that Islam taking root among the common people was taking over some of the Mazdist rituals. This can be seen to this day. Shiites are completely different from Sunnis. Islam also ensures social advancement. Tolerance does exist, but Muslims reach the highest positions, apart from one traditional advisory priest. Finally, the syncretism of Shiites with Mazdiyasna is so great that whether we worship fire or stone makes no difference to ordinary mortals. The priests of Mazdiyasna only had complaints, but they had no idea how to attract followers when equally strong competition arose. Bitterly disappointed that the Umayyads did not give the dignity of caliph to Ali's successors, they still considered the latter to be true imams, and once again embellished the story of the Persian princess by referring to the Avesta. 8 of them, descendants of Hussein with the princess, died tragically, but the 9th was to disappear and return as a savior. This is how the Avesta and the New Testament crept into Shurism, creating a new character. The priest Ferrohzadin often met with al-Mamun. He left an interesting treatise in which he wonders why people were abandoning the old religion. The reasons were quite simple. Mazdiyasna did not intend to allow people to learn Pahlavi so that they could read the holy books themselves, while Islam believed that everyone should learn the Quran, although today it is difficult because the Arabic language has evolved into numerous dialects, and the Quran has stuck in the old language. When studying Arabic, it is worth remembering this linguistic diglossia. They will teach us the Quranic language, but few will understand us on the street. This is a problem for modern Muslims, just as Latin once was for Christians, although it is politically convenient because you can convince them of a lot. Unfortunately, the Bible for the poor is not enough over time. Today, unfortunately, Islam in some parts of the world has adopted the attitude of the Mazdists. Finally, Prince Maser rose in rebellion. It is not very clear what he was counting on because Shiite Islam had already taken root, but it was the last straw. The rebellion was suppressed quite bloodily, and the attitude towards Mazdiyasna changed radically. It was probably inspired by people staying at court and brought a cruel fate to dogs in the world of Islam, and also led to the emigration of believers. This is the end of the acceptance of Mazdists in the lands of the Caliphate. Then also arose the myth that a dog bit the prophet, and this animal became unclean, although we will not find such texts in the Quran. Zoroastrians respected dogs very much. The original Islam was not negative towards dogs, as evidenced by some still existed traditions, such as giving a dog to a friend. The Mazdas did this as well. So they began to abuse dogs, which is already so sanctioned in Iran that it seems that the authorities have no idea why they are doing it, but they are doing it, although in Sunni countries we are beginning to see a return to reason and a change of attitude towards dogs. This behavior, similar to spitting in the sacred fire or throwing feces, led to the Zoroastrians starting to emigrate to Gujarat, where they were called Parsis. They were none other than Persians who had once fled the country. This was their only response and counteraccusation of polytheism, which unfortunately can be accused of when delving into the Avesta. The priests indeed behaved very passively in the fight against Islam. Although a few hundred years ago they were doing quite well with Christianity, because both sides destroyed their places of worship equally. The powerful religion, which in ancient times pushed the Persians to conquer and impose their views on the world, seeing in the ruler the viceroy of Ahura Mazda on earth, suddenly showed its impotence, although the viceroyship of the caliphs can also be derived from the Avesta. There was no wise elite, or the reluctance of the population was already strong enough that they did not want to fight for their priests. We will probably never know. Mazda was supposed to be forgotten. Those pushed into the depths of oblivion will survive. Erased and a bit like a necessary evil, although none of the religions of books would have come into being if not them. Everyone erased the first book in the shoe of being better. The Avesta returned to the consciousness of Europeans only in the 19th century, and was more of a magical concept than an ordinary first book, which is best seen in Freud's chatter. This man has absolutely no idea about Zoroaster and Mazdaism, and yet many associate fire worshippers only with his false gibberish. What is worse, few scientists still want to study the Avesta, and Iran, although it celebrates the Mazdist New Year and does not defend the cult, does not make it easy. The Magi came to Jesus, but we also forgot who they were. So what about the most important and first Christian holiday, the Epiphany, or, if you prefer, Orthodox Christmas? The Greek word magos appears in the Bible only 5 times and always refers to Zoroastrians, who were also famous for creating horoscopes, and although Judaism can be said to have even liked them, it still ordered people to stay away from fortune-tellers, astrologers. This survived in Christianity, and the reason for the order was more political than theological. Let's not mix religions. Let's remember that there are 2 versions of how the Magi reached Jesus. In one they were led by an angel. In the other it is a dream. They were not always 3 Magi either. If we are to reach for the sources, the first traditions speak of 12. This is a symbolic number if you add Jesus. 13 is a divine number. It started to bring misfortune from the day when Jacques de Molay tragically died. If anyone wanted to know where the superstition came from, in this way, reference was also made to the 12 tribes of Israel, which was to emphasize the continuation of the dignity of God's chosenness, to Christians, who consisted mainly of pagan nations. Copts to this day believe that there were 6 of them. The first mention of the 3 wise men appears in Origin. They brought 3 gifts. In the 6th century they were given names. Caspar from the Latin word Caesar, and had the same etymology as the German word Kaiser. Melchior from the Hebrew Melech, and Balthazar from Basilius. The tradition of writing names on doors existing in some countries did not at all involve writing the names of kings, and symbolically refers to the unification through 3 names of rulers. Over time, the meaning of the first letters was changed to Christus Manisionum Benedictit Christus Multorum Benefactor. Basilius, Melech, and Caesar simply passed into oblivion, and it was necessary to give it a new meaning. This custom was derived from the meaning of doors described in the book of Exodus. The emerging devotional practice of the time transformed the Magi into kings. Another theory is that it was about raising the rank of both Jesus and the Magi, which referred to the fragment about the gifts of the king of Tarshish and Sheba. Over time, they were given more and more features, so Melchior is 60 years old, Balthazar 40, and Caspar 20. It was only later that reference was made to the book of Genesis, and the Magi were given an appearance and lineage, which also established three characters, because according to the book of Genesis, the ancient world was divided into three parts between the descendants of Noah. The descendants of Shem inhabited Asia, Ham Africa, against which at least one country is probably now shouting, and Japheth Europe. Marco Polo mentions the city of Sava, where according to tradition the three magi whose bodies did not decompose were to be buried. This is also mentioned by a Franciscan monk. Perhaps there was such a place in Persia, but with the Mongols' departure from these lands, religious tolerance also left and it was forgotten. We do not know what happened to them later. Tradition states that they returned to their countries. According to the apocryphal account, there was a fourth magician, but he turned back. In the first images, they were depicted as Mazda's priests. It is also worth mentioning a certain anecdote related to the war between Byzantium and Persia. When Khosrows entered the territories of Palestine, the invaders destroyed Christian churches in revenge, but spared the Basilica of the Nativity, because they saw the figures of the magicians on the decoration of the walls. The truth was a bit different. The invaders did not destroy politically important holy places, and those related to state policy were transformed into mosques, such as Hagia Sophia. It was such a politicized building because the decrees of the Basileus were announced there, that if you wanted to refer to the continuation of the dynasty and have the most important symbol of statehood, you had to reach for Hagia Sophia. The Basilica of the Nativity was not a politicized place, but an important symbol. A tax for infidels fills the budget with additional money, and is more welcome than destroying an important symbol. During the Crusades, the Latins will not be so lenient towards the Eastern Rite Christians gathered in the building, about which is forgotten. The conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which created the Star of Bethlehem, is called the Dance of the Stars and is a fairly rare phenomenon that has been described twice. The second time was in 1603, sometimes called Keppler's constellation. The priests describing the fate of the state, based on the stars, were certainly intrigued by this phenomenon. Jupiter was the planet of kings, and Stern was the symbol of the kingdom of Amurru, or Syria, of which Palestine was also a part. Guided by this knowledge, the Mazda'ists, searching for and waiting for a savior, set off on their journey and became immersed in the history of the new religion. If anyone today mocks the significance of stars and the belief in how they changed the world, they should remember 1999 and the siege of Romania, where one could see a total solar eclipse. Seems funny, but the world went there just in case. It is no secret that stars were interpreted as a metaphysical phenomenon. What did the magicians see? Certainly not a comet. Halley's Comet appeared a few years earlier in 12 BC, unless we assume that the calendar and birth had a bigger error. Let's go back to the tradition of 7 years. Not very realistic. According to Kepler's findings, it was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces, which happens once every 800 years, and according to the books that Keppler reviewed, it was supposed to herald the coming of the Messiah. Keppler analyzed mainly Jewish writings. We don't know if he had access to the Avesta. Doubtful, but it also mentions it. During his life, Keppler was ridiculed because of the calendar error. At that time, it was believed that Jesus was born 8 years later. It was one of many errors in creating the calendar. As you can see, adding can make life stupid and difficult, and the creators of the calendar and its numerous corrections were an example of this. Only archaeological research in Babylon and Egypt during the interwar period confirmed his theses when texts mentioning this phenomenon were found in that period. I think the Copts are closer to the truth. Traditionally, caravans are at least 6. In the desert, looting was the norm. Everyone agreed on this for a long time. It's easy money. Uncle Arshak is Armenian, then 12. I also like this royal name. No one said that they put together one package. They could have hidden in a cave from the storm, and the Holy Family was already there. It is worth remembering something else. The Epiphany did not take place exactly on the day of birth, even if we accept all these errors, corrections, repeated errors. Jesus was a bit older. This also helped introduce and justify the Latin Christmas. The first Christians celebrated it with the idea that by showing him to people, he was born for the world. This is the Orthodox doctrine. If we are talking about the Avesta and the Persians, we should mention what they called themselves and why a counterfeit Avesta could have been created. It was the Aryu or Aryan people. Many will cry now, but it was not the Germans or the Slavs. It was not and is not any other nation that claims racial superiority. The only Aryan people were and will be the Persians, those who are often called something worse. This brutal truth certainly does not and will not fit many. This is a very interesting historical event. When Temujin became the Khagan known as Genghis Khan, he invited the leaders of all the religions of his country to his place for a discussion about dogmas. No one has ever managed to do something like that since. Nowadays, such meetings take place, but contrary to appearances, not everyone takes part in them. Only the most powerful religions. These people were to present the dogmas of their religions to the Khagan and discuss them among themselves. Unfortunately, the discussions did not go very well, especially when it came to talking about Islam, Orthodoxy, Latin Christianity. It got to the point where the guests started to order the Khagan whether he should talk to the followers of other religions or not. Buddhism bothered them a lot. After listening to everyone, Khagan invited them to an audience and stated that he did not understand their argument about dogmas. He began to cite similarities, for example, between the Holy Trinity and the Hindu Trinity, and then he roared at them that after delving into these views, he concluded that they had to learn to listen because they were all talking about the same thing, so why were they arguing? He announced that he recognized all of them. In a sense, he was a follower of each trend. And he left, leaving them open-mouthed. Well, that never happened. And maybe that's why even during World War II, when there were shipments to these areas, the Mongols and Kazakhs, although they themselves had nothing, because they were politically dangerous, shared everything regardless of religion or origin. Acknowledge the Yasa and we will help you. George Hogg knew perfectly well what he was doing when he took these orphans to the steppe. Nobody cares, it's the only place after Scotland where nothing won't fall. And the people who live there help each other because of the place they live in. Because without it you can't survive in the steppe. The countries of these regions have officially adopted some religion, but the shamanic tradition is very strong there. It has not been eradicated, and there is no point in expecting a Mongol, a Tatar, a Kazakh to be a follower of something with blinkers on. Unless it's Tungari. These religions were accepted only because they interested someone. It was never a fanatical profession of faith. We believed, but we allowed other traditions. We are a bit Baha'is, although this view is new. Every religion started as a sect. Akbar tried something similar to Baha'i, but it died with him. Probably he died because of it. Baha'i was born from this union. Queen Maria of Romania was a follower. Her husband was gay, he accepted it. The famous hairdresser Antoine Ciplikowski said that she was the wisest of the entire Saxon-Cottbus family. She was characterized by extraordinary culture. She was the crowned head, and she never spoke to the cleaning lady who worked in his salon as a servant, although she could and did wait in line. An extraordinary person. She was showed in the most expensive film in the history of Romanian cinematography, but it was worth it. Antoine did not live to see it, although he was also an extraordinary figure. Great for movie. Man who lost everything was millionaire. Slept in coffin. His relationship with wife who actually created him accept his sexuality. His death itself is mysterious. Unfortunately, you have to grow up to such tolerance. You have to delve into these books yourself and not let people talk you into it. Everything I did for Ahura Mazda. This is what the famous inscription from Darius' tomb says. Darius had many reasons to explain himself. A commoner became a ruler in a rather interesting and brutal way, but he would not have become one if he had not had the support of the priests. He was a pragmatist. It was Ahura Mazda who listened to his explanations and only he. Hypocritical, of course. This saying still exists today among both Greeks and Persians. It's never worth explaining too much about what you've done. Painted Easter eggs. Planting cress is also Zoroastrianism. A lot of it in Easter comes from Zoroastrianism, more than from Judaism. It is the Zoroastrian New Year.